start with you. As your colleague has just mentioned, government under the Kansas Constitution is required to provide a suitable education for every child, and it's also required to redistrict every 10 years based on the census tract maps. Could you address what other priorities, if any, state government should have, and how those priorities might be funded going forward?
Sure. You started with the first two, which are redistricting and providing funding for suitable education. I'd start there because, as most of the people in this room probably know, they didn't redistrict this year, and the courts had to step in and do it. They aren't providing suitable funding for education, and I believe strongly that in this latest round of school funding litigation, the courts are going to step in again. They also need to pass a budget every year, and the session had to be extended because of the infighting and bickering, and they couldn't get the budget passed this year. Beyond that, and those are the statutory and constitutional responsibilities of the legislature. Beyond that, government exists to solve common problems. We have problems or issues. We have a problem about getting point A to point B. We build a highway, or we build a railroad. We have a problem or an issue that people don't have access to health care, so we establish a system that facilitates that, especially for our most vulnerable citizens, seniors, people with disabilities. Those are the moral responsibilities of government. That's why they exist, and those are the priorities that I will champion along with public education and redistricting if I'm there for 10 years, if I get elected to the state senate.
Thank you. Ms. Johnston, could you respond to the same question about what should be the priorities for the state legislature?
Well, I think our number one priority is to fulfill the responsibilities that were given, as Kyle was mentioning. And in the last session, we didn't see that happening. They did not successfully do what they had set out to do in terms of redistricting, and they had to go to the courts, and in terms of education, we're falling behind. But I do think that in general, the government should support the citizens, and also I think economic growth is extremely important, especially during difficult times and during a recession, that I think that the government has some responsibility to ensure that the policies that they're putting in place will foster economic growth in the state, which then should also foster job growth. Now, the sad thing to me is that sometimes when those who are elected officials are looking at this problem, they're looking at it from the wrong end of the spectrum. Because in order to grow the economy, we need to be in a situation where Kansans have good jobs to meet their needs, and everyday people have money in their pocket to spend on what they need to buy. Because it's that spending that is a primary driver of the economy as well, and creates business profits, which they can then use to create jobs. And so just randomly throwing incentive money at businesses is not the answer, or alleviating taxes at the top is not the answer. We need to make sure that we are considering what's best for all Kansans and really ensuring true economic growth for the state.
Mr. Reed, could you also address the question of Kansas legislative priorities?
Okay, the two things that I would see as priorities if I'm elected. One, I think that we could address transparency or full disclosure in campaign funding, that we know where the money is coming from, and the Supreme Court, when they ruled that corporations had the right to speak and that the speech was equivalent to money, they did not rule that we could not have laws that made campaign money traceable, and that people, when they were speaking through their donations, would have the right to do that in private. So I think that's one thing that I would place as a priority. I think the other thing is the setting up of the health insurance exchanges. I think we need to move ahead with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I think most of the resistance to the Affordable Care Act is because of misinformation and distortion of what it is. And when people understand, it'll be good for Kansas. It'll be an important safety net for our citizens. And the Supreme Court has ruled it is constitutional, so we need to move ahead with that.
Yeah, I want to focus a little bit on one of the priorities that is in the Constitution at the moment, because I think it's in some peril, and that is the obligation of the state to provide for a suitable education for all students. As a part of the governor's plan to reform the school finance system, one of the things they would like to try to do away with is litigation against the state by school districts and others, challenging the level of funding that exists in the state. And one of the devices for doing that is to try to repeal the provision in the Constitution that requires the state to provide a suitable education. It will take senators willing to stand up against an effort to undercut the current priorities in order to ensure that they remain in the Constitution and that the state remains responsible for funding a suitable education for every student. I've got a lot of other priorities I'd like to see the state address, but the first order of business is to keep the folks that are running the show now from doing more damage than they've already done.